Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here are my two newest worm bins. They've got European nightcrawlers living in them. And these two bins were launched 1 week ago. And this will be our first check-in with these little guys. They were given some food even prior to the worms being introduced. I built up the systems, and then even before placing the worms in there, we left a feeding for them. So after a week, I'm curious to see how they've done in here and how they've done with that first feeding. Just a brief history on where these worms came from. These are the European nightcrawlers. They used to live in the 3 yellow buckets. And to get the worms to exit the material that they were inhabiting, the contents of the 3 buckets were placed into this somewhat larger tub. And it had been set up with a horizontal migration feeding zone to get all the worms over out of the castings so that they could be hauled out to launch those new systems. And in order to catch the stragglers, I did this off camera after the launch of those systems. I set this bait box up to try to round up the stragglers. I've been in here twice to aerate the material, to promote drying, to further motivate the worms to want to exit their material. So I did the last aeration yesterday, and as far as I'm concerned, this material's been depopulated, is ready to be harvested. So we're going to do a reunion with the stragglers that we've gotten together over here in this bait box. Give the worms their second feeding, technically. First feeding was already in there before they got introduced. So I'm going to get a glove on, get the 2 new systems up on the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get started. So now the assortment of foods that I've put out here for them is pretty routine. It's a bunch of stuff from my freezer. It's fruits and veggies and a couple days worth of coffee, which includes the coffee filters that we'll be able to utilize as feeding zone indicators. Little tradition down here. And the somewhat oddball thing that I intend to use as bedding is my failed attempt at starting pepper seeds. You could see most of these pepper seeds just started to rot away in these bags. In a few cases you can actually see that they started pretty neatly sprouting. This was the most successful one, and in this case the contents of the container or the bag are completely dry because I didn't close it properly. So I'm a little bit behind the 8 ball now as far as my gardening project. I intended to plant a bunch of sprouts yesterday and I was all set. I prepared a mix. I prepared the table where the grow light is. I set the timer up. I got all the trays ready. I did a water test to make sure they're not leaking. Saving the check on the progress of the seeds for last, only to be surprised that all my lead up to that was for nothing because there's nothing to plant, regrettably. I guess the other option is just to skip the whole attempt at starting my own seeds and just buying plants that I can stick in the ground without going through the trouble of preparing them. We did a little experiment in the yellow buckets with these worms to throw some corn cobs in there to try to not fiddle with them and allow natural progress to break them down. And something about the number 263 rings in my mind, like maybe that's how long it's been since the corn cobs were introduced to these worms when they still lived in the yellow buckets, and it seemed easy enough just to bring the corn cobs over and let the little experiment continue. And the whole idea behind that was just to see, roughly how long it takes for corn cobs without any help to break down in the worm bin, and we're well over 6 months now. And making good progress, but I opted to just not interfere with that process and try to preserve those corn cobs as we worked on getting the worms out of their old space, and just let it continue here. So I've not fiddled with those corn cobs. They're just continuing, and the counter in my spreadsheet is also continuing to track how long it's been. And at some point we'll simply not run into them anymore. But I've got this feeling that that's a little ways off still. And I just keep getting this feeling like I should go grab the bait box from the finished castings and take care of the reunion part of this check-in so that I don't forget, because I keep getting this funny feeling like I'm gonna get to the end of this feeding and realize that I totally forgot to take care of emptying the bait box and reuniting the worms. So I guess one of the sort of casualties, if you want to consider it that way, is that the worms get a little bit skinny when they're in material that I'm actively allowing to dry, and that was the case when the migration was underway. So some of the worms made their way over into the horizontal migration feeding zone where there was abundant moisture and stuff. Some of the worms that didn't manage to make it over there right away were somewhat deprived of moisture, and as a result their size decreased. So it does seem like they're basking in the high degree of moisture that's in here, and hopefully that'll result in our worms getting a little bit more plump again in a hopefully in a short while. And well, maybe the other explanation for many small worms is that perhaps we're also seeing babies. It's kind of usually my hope, is that that's the explanation for seeing lots and lots of little worms. But you know what? I think we better just follow through with my little idea there of grabbing the bait box from the castings. At this point, making it official. That's a done deal. Those castings are now going to be considered as officially depopulated and harvestable. So before we do this, I'm just going to give everyone a little look at how many worms we succeeded in rounding up out of that material. Right from the start it seemed like we wouldn't get many, because we did go through the material a little bit together prior to doing the haul out of the primary population along with the horizontal migration feeding zone that they were occupying. So I had this expectation of not too many worms, but it does seem like we've got a few in here. Some of them are enjoying this piece of banana peel, and it looks like we've got another piece of banana peel. Not too surprising that that's where we're finding a good many of the worms, basking in the yummy foods. Seems like there might have been a couple other things in here, but I don't exactly remember. This could be tomato. And I don't know how to make this into a completely fair, perfect split, other than kind of just dividing the entire thing down the middle and introducing half of it into one of the systems. So handful number 1 has been placed over here into bin number 2, and then the remainder will empty over here into bin number 1. And as many of you might know, I always turn to the viewers when I'm introducing worms to a system, whether it's the launch of a brand new system like we did together a week ago, at which point I asked everyone to contribute their suggested estimates for how many worms were released into the systems. And here too, I'm going to be requesting that everyone leave a comment and provide me with your guess as to how many worms were just added to each system. If your estimate is such that you think an equal number were placed into both, then tell me that and let me know what the estimate is. If you think one or the other introduction of worms was greater than the other, then just specify how many specifically were placed into each bin, and then I'll be updating our estimated worm count calculations to include everyone's input. That's what I think makes it interesting, that everyone gets to participate, and that I think actually, I don't know, to me it seems like that's probably the best way to arrive at a fairly accurate estimate. So let's set this aside. I'll have a chance to look through that in more detail just to make sure we've not left anyone behind, but I'd like to proceed with getting this feeding completed. So these were the Hungarian apple peppers, known as Alma paprika. And what else do we have? There were 4 different types, so we'll place the failed experiment into each system equally again. Kind of unfortunate. I mean, I didn't use all my seeds up, and that's kind of made me think that perhaps I could just sow another round of seeds directly into the potting soil that I prepared for these seeds that died. And hegyes ajú paprika. In Hungarian, that means the pointy bottom type Hungarian pepper. If you're familiar with the Hungarian peppers, those are those yellow, very light yellow colored, almost white colored peppers. And some of them have the pointy bottom, other ones have that round bottom like a bell pepper. And I believe the round ones are the ones that are considered to be the ones that most frequently get used in stuffed peppers. I even have here the question mark peppers. Just some seeds that were laying around without any labels. So anyone's guess is as good as mine, but I figured, hey, they were put aside for a reason. They're probably good peppers, so let's just plant them and see what happens. So, returning the leftovers we found from feeding number 1, as well as what had been the feeding zone indicator, this piece of cardboard pizza box. Same story here. Get these leftovers back down into the feeding zone, and what my prepared bedding consists of nowadays is actually stuff that I pulled out of these 2 containers before introducing the worms. It felt to me like I had just put way too much material into these bins. I didn't want to start with so much, so I pulled all of this darker material out of these 2 tubs before adding the worms. So this stuff is super aged, much more old than what I normally have around here as far as prepared bedding. It was 50 days priming, waiting for worms to be added. So much more mature. And I don't know if mature is the right way to think about it, but I guess try to think of a good word, and it's not occurring to me. Kind of priming, you know, kind of maturing to the point where it's probably nice and soft and ready for worms to inhabit it. And it seems like today's feeding is going in with a fair bit of frozen material too. Let's give them a little bit of grit. Let's give them the coffee. Spread it out. Same story here. And now we can backfill. So I'm going to do what I usually do, which is to turn to the outer edges of the system to bring in material that we could use to cover up our feeding zones. At the same time aerating everything. Here I'm not seeing too many worms occupying this material out on the edges. Sometimes I wonder if that just has something to do with the fact that that's not where the food was placed, so it's not too surprising, or sometimes I just worry a little bit that perhaps the material is not quite as damp and hospitable as it could be. But I don't think that's really the case here. It does feel to me like the material down low is quite damp. And I am seeing worms, but not quite as many as we saw in the feeding zone. So that too seems to me like a perfectly normal observation. And let's see here. Any wormies to be seen? Sometimes after they get moving, they're a little bit easier to spot. And I will, as I mentioned earlier, look that over a little bit more carefully just to make sure we don't leave anybody behind. And now I've got myself another couple gallons of lovely vermicompost to add to my collection. So, I think we're almost finished. Ooh, very gooey stuff, and not too surprising, a whole bunch of worms hanging out in there. So that was some of the stuff I pulled up from the bottom. Super damp, super cozy. No surprise that that's where the worms are hanging out. And you know, over time the material will all gradually start to collapse a little bit, because right now it's, you know, very capable of allowing airflow in between the particle matter of all these shredded pieces of paper and cardboard, which does enable bits of it that aren't well protected with plastic covers to dry a little bit. So in the beginning, it is fair to assume that we're going to encounter little bits of dry material here and there, but for that reason I do take care to make sure that the plastic covers are on as thoroughly as possible, so that the system's capable of hanging on to its moisture content. The moisture content of the system seemed pretty good, and the prepared bedding we placed in there was pretty damp, not to mention the foods were probably bringing in with them a little bit of moisture too, so I think we're going to be in good shape here. So I got a couple things I got to take care of getting cleaned up, put away, but that's all boring. I'm not going to keep you around for that. Really quick before I go, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.